Okay, so this is going to be a brief overview of some of the main points of Russian formalist theory and Soviet montage, as well as kind of hitting some of the big points that will, if not make reading Eisenstein and Vertov easier, will at least make what they're saying make a little more sense to you as we work through it this week, okay? So first off, what is formalism? Well, formalism is a mode of analysis that starts off in literary theory and then expands into other arts, beginning in the late 19th century and into the 19 teens. The basic idea is that everything that we need to understand a work of art and what it says and how it functions is contained within the form of the work of art itself. Okay, so for example, in poetry or literature, the construction of the sentences, the juxtaposition within paragraphs of those sentences, the comparative imagery, how all of that is put together creates meaning for us on the whole. That's the very basic concept. It gets a lot more complicated, but the idea is simply just thinking through how these forms for art make us make sense of them as people who are reading, interpreting, and digesting the work of art, okay? So in film, the idea here starts to come together out of earlier theories of formalism. So we'll talk a little bit about Victor Shklovsky's essay, The Work of Art as Device, in our synchronous session. But for our purposes, just to get to film theory in this little brief video, it's basically that the idea is that the art itself is the device through which we can understand the art. And so in film, the way this manifests is that editing, the literal construction of the film, is the means by which we understand that film and create meaning out of it. Yes, we are putting together thoughts about all of the stuff on screen, right? And that is very important, right? But even editing within the shot. So how are people moving across the screen? How are things being staged in front of the camera? How is the camera moving? And then when you put all of that together by choosing different shots, by creating a finished film through editing, that is where the meaning comes from. We are looking at it and we're taking in the whole thing, but the construction itself is how we understand the function. Now, in Soviet montage theory, which is really focused on editing as the system, right? So yes, there are formalists that focus on the construction of mise-en-scène. There are formalists that focus on the construction from shot to shot of movement, either of the camera, but all of this is going on, but it's really emphasizing in Soviet montage theory the edits themselves. So literally how images are juxtaposed with one another. And that is what is going to create meaning. This is demonstrated by Lev Kuleshov through a series of editing experiments, here explained by Alfred Hitchcock. Now, I also want to note that because I'm waiting on a better recording system, that you may need to actually watch this clip yourself. I have new things coming, but they're not quite here yet. So just know this is going to be very quick, but it is relying on my computer's sound.
Now, the third way is what one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up Let me show you what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees, and he smiles. Now, what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
Okay, so out of Kuleshov's experiments and his students, right, come a lot of different theories about how this works. And the two dominant ones are from Sergei Eisenstein and Ziga Vertov. Okay, so I'm just going to break down one by one kind of what their deal is and some of the things that you've read about or will read about before class and come ready to talk about them, okay? So first up, Sergei Eisenstein. Eisenstein is extremely interested in the effects of different types of editing, and he pays a lot of attention to shot order, duration, repetition, and rhythm, and he writes about this constantly. Okay, so we've read one of the essays, Methods of Montage. We'll talk about those a little bit and how they're broken down. He gives some great examples of what they are actually. He also is very fond of writing about editing as a violent act, something that will shock viewers, right? So that the edits themselves should not be hidden. Okay, so not like the Hollywood system, not like, shot one to shot two gives us narrative form. Okay, that's not what formalists are interested in, and it's not what Soviet montage theory is about. Yes, they do that within their films. Even Eisenstein has kind of what we call in the industry coverage, right? Where you're simply showing different things from different angles and creating a sense of space and time in continuity. But Eisenstein says even when you're doing those things, you should think about how long those shots are playing out, what order you're putting those shots in, and the idea for Eisenstein is not to let viewers simply settle into a film's story, but to constantly be thinking about um, what he eventually starts to think of as the third meaning. Okay, so that there's an implicit meaning, an explicit meaning, and then the third meaning, which is the big shock idea we get. Okay, and this is going to take us out of the experience of pure narrative and make us aware of the film medium itself and its status as a constructed object. And then once we start to think about it that way, it will allow us to draw larger connections across the work of art through analysis of the form itself. Okay, that core idea is not any different from anybody else, but what he really drives into is the idea of shock, the idea of editing as a form of violence. He talks about them as violent acts, right? Revolutionary acts that are going to disrupt complacency. Okay, so come to class ready to talk about specifically the Odessa Steppe sequence from Battleship Potemkin. You have probably seen at least clips of this in film history class, maybe intro classes. But what we're going to do is really spend some time going through different types of shots and thinking through the different types of montage he's talking about in his Method of Montage essay. And we'll also talk about the complexities of his writing in about film form in the longer essay we read this week, okay? Finally, just kind of to give us a little bit of a counterpoint, Dziga Vertov thought about filmmaking in slightly different terms than Eisenstein did. So, in addition to the editing itself, Vertov was also heavily invested in making the full apparatus of filmmaking visible to the audience. Okay. He was obsessed with the unfiltered possibilities of the camera. So his main theory that we read a formative essay about this week is called Kino Eye, and it is all about the idea that the camera as a mechanical object can be left running and can capture truth and life as it occurs outside of the influence of anybody writing about that experience, right? So if I were to sit outside and then write a story about what I saw, that would have my subjective, subconscious thought processes uh, injected into it out of purely the way that you would construct that narrative as a writer, right? The connection from brain to hand to paper. It is not possible to be objective, okay? Vertov saw the camera as a radical technology that functioned as an extension of the human body, of the imperfection of our eyes, meaning that we see, right? Our eyes see the world as it is, but our brain filters that perception through a whole lot of different lenses while we're thinking about it. But the camera does not have that filter, right? You set the camera up, it sees what it sees, it prints that on the film. Now, how do you get around, if this is your idea, how do you get around thinking about making a movie that is not just the camera sitting there for 3 hours, okay? Or however long. And even then, that has influence, right? Because you have decided to start and stop and position the camera to look at something, right? For Vertov, this solution comes through making the audience aware not only of the constructed nature of the film, so constantly drawing their attention to the edits, which is a foundational thing across Soviet montage theory and formalists more generally, but to also put the filmic apparatus into the film as much as possible so that it lends a second layer of awareness of what is happening. So simply including the camera, including the process of editing. If you've ever seen Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, which we'll watch clips of in our synchronous session, you can see this happen, right? And what is the purpose of this? Well, you want to capture life as it exists, okay? And what all of this starts to turn into for our purposes in this class as a foundational theory is that it generates an understanding about, first, the constructed nature of cinema itself that becomes hugely influential on further thinkers and theorists in film studies as the discipline develops. It also allows for a foregrounding of the possibilities of technology and of how narrative structure can play out, how it can reflect dominance, how it can subvert that dominance, okay? This is very important for theories of realism, which we'll talk about soon. It's very important for theories of formal nature further down the line. So if we think about kind of the work of David Bordwell is kind of picking up on strands of this theory. Um, and that's kind of where we are. So Vertov and Eisenstein have kind of competing ideas. Vertov and Eisenstein did not get along necessarily. Vertov very much was a documentarian and did not believe that you could achieve anything through fiction filmmaking, not necessarily through narrative, because he was constructing narratives. He was telling these long documentary stories about the Soviet people and the new nation that had formed and all of this stuff. But the idea of what was going to shock people and make them aware within that constructedness, they also had some different disagreements about. So it wasn't just the violence of the editing for Vertov, it was also the shock of seeing somebody making the film that ostensibly you're watching, right? And realizing that constantly you're watching a constructed object. So I hope that this has been a helpful general overview. Like I said, we will break down these essays and the ideas behind them and use some concrete examples from the films on Thursday in our synchronous session. So I'll see you then, and come with questions and whatever else you want to talk about.